Okay, good evening. This is Richard Shu, host of Shu Untied. Today I'm really thrilled and honored to have with me as my guest Trond Undheim, who's a futurist, scholar, author, entrepreneur, a fellow podcaster. Trond, welcome to the program.
Thank you so much, Richard. It's a pleasure to be here.
It's a pleasure to have you. So let me start by asking you. We obviously you cover a wide range of subjects. We won't be able to get to all of them today, but maybe we can start with your PhD thesis. Let me take you back in time, which I understand was done on remote work, well before the pandemic, obviously, before the internet even. Talk to me a little bit about what that was all about.
Well, it was actually in the first internet wave. I mean, people were very excited about what the internet was going to do to the workplace back in 1997, 1998, when I started this work.
Mm-hmm.
And I wasn't equally excited for some reason. I kind of thought that this was, people were a little ahead of themselves. So I decided to actually kind of empirically study and go after the people that were advertising this the most aggressively. So these were the tech companies, the telcos, and they were putting stuff in their advertising. And I kind of framed it as, the nomadic worker, the vision of this nomadic worker that we today, over 20 years later, we have a different context, and the technology is far different. Plus, we've had a pandemic where we actually needed to be remote. It is kind of interesting to look back at what we were discussing then, the ideas people had back then, when you could just imagine the kinds of technologies they were touting as, fantastic back then, because it was not Zoom, let me tell you that. It was very rudimentary. IP telephony was very rudimentary. But anyway, that got me started because I concluded with a perhaps not so popular message, in Silicon Valley, where I did some of my fieldwork. Lucky for me, I was at Berkeley, not Stanford. They would have probably killed me at Stanford at that time. Mm-hmm. But I ended up calling my PhD thesis "What the Net Can't Do," and the idea being that there are things that are not actually ideal when you think about remote work. And one of the things that I really looked at was even the people who were advertising it the hardest. When I really asked them, are you using this yourself? Do you truly actually practice what you preach? None of them really admitted to doing so. And, the investors would be like, well, I would never invest in a startup unless I can go and beat up the founder for lunch. Well, beat up, but, talk to them and say, hey, we need to fix some things. Now, that has maybe changed in 20 years. There are people who claim they invest remotely, although, far less than you would think. And that's 20 years ago. And generally, I would say that the challenging thing with remote work, and this remains post-COVID, post-everything, is that if you're trying to convince somebody for the first time or for the 10th time, if it is a hard sell, you would never try to start that conversation remotely, would you? Right? So there's something about when you have your physical presence, you are all that much more convincing. And that was really what my work way back then was all about. And it ended up a little bit being this argument, Richard, that, if you have the juxtaposition of being completely remote and having some amount of technology, but then being physically present and having that same technology, perhaps better technology, and you are physically together, how can you really compete with that? It's almost like a mathematical argument. You can't win that one. So I'm not saying remote work is impossible. I practice a lot of remote work, but you have to make this very, very interesting trade-off. You are obviously going to try to be physically present where your priorities lie. Now, these days we have multiple priorities. I happen to, work in 2 places or 3 places. I have different priorities. That's difficult. So you have to make those trade-offs. But the whole reason that remote work was such a vision is that people assumed that the work part was so easy that it could be carried, off without being there. There was this idea, like we will all sit in our private islands or, go on vacation all the time. Yes. Right. So some of that happened during the pandemic. It's very interesting to look at that.
Yeah.
But what are we seeing now? Pressure to go back to the workplace. There's real pressure and there's real reason. So anyway, this was a long time ago. Some of the things have changed. It's gotten far easier to be a remote worker.
Yeah.
But some of the initial problems still persist.
Well, what are some of the? Oh, it's interesting. Those are interesting observations. I mean, you mentioned, the idea if you want to try to persuade somebody, that's really hard to do remotely. Any other kind of areas where remote just doesn't work? I mean, obviously there are many areas where it does work. I mean, you and I, this is great. We wouldn't be able to have this podcast if it weren't for
honestly, Richard, some
yeah.
podcasts I prefer this setup, right? Because sometimes you actually want to have a couple of screens, and you actually don't want to be in person because there's something about this particular relationship of a podcast interview where there's an advantage actually to being remote.
Yeah.
So I would completely agree with that and that's new. I would say that has emerged. The fact that there are certain things that you can actually do really, really well because the technology has gotten to a level, and also perhaps that you have different priorities. You actually do want to have these technology enhancements that would probably still be a little odd between us if you were looking at 6 screens when we were talking and drinking coffee or some other beverage, right, at a bar or whatever. We were doing a more loose, like perhaps around the fireplace interview. Then you wouldn't actually necessarily have all these sort of technology gadgets and helping you.
Yeah.
Now, I happen to sometimes want that in an interview because I want to have that edge that I have some screens. I know, that you created your Rubik's Cube. I have all this information at my fingertips, Richard.
No,
but honestly, I just came and, this is something we thought we would talk about today, right? I just coming out with a book, Augmented Lean. And there we talk about digital transformation in the manufacturing industry specifically, but with lessons for all of work, really. And the interesting thing there is, of course, everyone has been saying, automation, 24/7 factories, lights out, workers are not needed, automation, robots are coming. Yeah, there's some of that, but MIT's Work of the Future study came out last year and said we didn't see as many robots as people are scared about. Right. So if the robots are coming, they're certainly not coming yet. And the thing is, even if robots are coming, there's something really physical and depends really very much on infrastructure in manufacturing. So unfortunately, during the pandemic, yes, there were some factory workers who were able, surprisingly, to work remotely. So that's the big surprise. The factories didn't all shut down, and one could actually do a lot more remotely. But the bulk of the work for operators on the shop floor, right? That's maybe it's coordinating machines, coordinating robots, whatever it is, it's coordination. And it's a lot of face-to-face work. It's a lot of tweaking. And much of that, unfortunately, still cannot be carried on, without being there.
Yeah.
So it's an interesting juxtaposition, I guess, between the things that you can do better remote and some of the things that are persistently place based and really are based on infrastructure and physical resources.
Is that the thesis of your book, or what is the main thesis of your book?
No, so it's a slightly more nuanced thesis, right? So we are talking about the rise of sort of the augmented workforce. So the biggest challenge, I think, in manufacturing has been this very loose and perhaps a little counterintuitive idea that automation is going to solve all problems. This whole belief in, the theory of Industry 4.0, which is this cluster of technologies, AI among them, but and virtualization and artificial intelligence, but augmented reality, as part of that, all of those things, Internet of Things, a lot of things that are, of course, very, very important to factories today that enable digital communication. But what we are seeing is that there's just a lot of progress that can be made with far simpler means. And moreover, if you don't start with your workers and saying, what are they doing well today, and what are the things they're complaining about, and what are the things that they call bottlenecks, you're starting in the wrong end of the problem. So an augmented lean approach is this combination of sort of a top-down, bottom-up perspective. You have to figure out this conundrum, which honestly, Silicon Valley, I think, made a choice, way back when, right? So they started developing productivity technology, but only for the office worker. So with the result that automation developed in one direction, robots, machinery, all that stuff, with zero user interface. And then productivity technology, billions of dollars of investments, many, many startups. Fantastic, right? So if you're sitting in an office today, you have this fantastic technology optimized to you, to the consumer, and it is user tested, and it has all of these things. So we can actually enhance our work. We are augmented workers in and of the fact that, yes, we may still be tethered to some screens and smartphones, but we have all these options, and we can be remote to a large extent. Factory workers have not. And the reason we think is that they were stuck, their management was stuck, and honestly, all the equipment providers were stuck in this idea that efficiency of machines is what's going to solve all the problems. And so the challenge is the workforce, was not part of that.
Right. But do you think that's something inherent, or is this just a question of the technology catching up? I mean, eventually will that be the case, or you think there's something inherent in the
No. I mean, we're describing the fact that over the last few years, there's a lot of new exciting developments. So, these new frontline worker platforms are evolving with, no-code software that luckily is much easier to deal with for industry because it doesn't depend on programmers even, right? You can take anyone who is a quality manager and you can, use and tweak these applications and build things natively inside your own company and run the process yourself and really achieve a lot of productivity effects. So it's an optimistic book. Augmented Lean is an optimistic book because we have seen, and my co-author, is the CEO of a company that represents this kind of technology. But more importantly, I think we're sort of saying, let's not get lost in this automation phase, because augmentation is actually as a potential already here. And we don't have to sit there and wait for perfect augmented reality glasses or something like that. I mean, it's fantastic when this kind of stuff arrives. There's already RealWear, right? There's headsets that actually extend the productivity of workers. I had the CEO of RealWear on my one of my podcasts. He's coming up soon. So there are very exciting things happening in augmentation technology. But the point is, software today is about to turn a corner. Finally, there's some interest for industrial software beyond kind of these old legacy systems, right? Cloud is now finally coming to the manufacturing sector. User interfaces are improving slowly, but still, you'll buy $1 million or a $10 million machine, and the user interface or a $10 million robot, and the user interface of that robot might be a proprietary interface with a custom software that only one person knows how to run, and you have to train your workers over 2 months. That's really ridiculous. So we're describing this change where this is now finally kind of unlocking. People are realizing this wasn't right, and good entrepreneurs are coming in, challenging the incumbents, and forcing, I think, a change in the industry. And that's really goodness if you believe that the worker kind of needs to be set free. And also that the worker can innovate, right? Because think about the really slumbering potential of all these workers that have been told, don't think, just do this, and don't even worry about the whole production process, right? Well, now you can feed all that back to them appropriately. You can establish digital work instructions that actually make a lot of sense. You can give them things like, we were studying Stanley Black & Decker, and it turns out, of course, when someone on their shop floor is building one of their connected tools, they know very well already what's being done at Home Depot or any retailer. They know exactly how their tools are being used, and almost who's using it, and how they need to tweak their production process to answer to that. So in fact, production, there's so much going on there today, and it's surprisingly not covered, because the perspective is always more automation, which is a little bit of a simplistic message.
How did you get into this area of research? I mean, obviously didn't come from your PhD, or maybe it did. How did you get into this area of manufacturing that you seem very knowledgeable about?
Well, so my skill, Richard, is that I seem pretty knowledgeable about a lot of things that I just learned, but that's a skill, right? But I will tell you this. I got into manufacturing because I had been working at MIT with a bunch of startups. In fact, I was running the startup exchange program with working with all of MIT's top startups. And one of them, after, I wasn't working there anymore, but we had developed a relationship, and I had one of the CEOs, the founders of those companies on my other podcast, Futurist. And after the podcast, we said, well, we should actually start working on something together. So over the last 2 years, I've been doing field work in manufacturing, and it was a almost life-changing experience, Richard, because this is not something, if I am a bit of a digital transformation expert, perhaps, or have worked on future work topics, that did not mean that I understood manufacturing. So it was a really eye-opener to spend time on factory floors, talk to workers, talk to operators, and leaders in the space, and realize pen and paper still exists, right? Yeah. And there are very real challenges, when you're running a manufacturing operation. And seeing that firsthand, but also seeing the potential of the change that's coming, and perhaps still keeping, my eyes open and not getting drowned in this rhetoric, because every industry has its own kind of rhetoric. And I think I'm still enough of an outsider that I can see some of the blind spots inside of an industry like manufacturing. I haven't gone fully native. So I think that's my trick. Don't go native, but dive in and out.
So one of your labels or titles is Futurist. Tell me a little bit about that. What do you see in the future? What are the things you are prognosticating for us in the future?
Well, this, most futurists today have stopped prognosticating. They might pretend that they know a little bit, but very soon, if you talk to them, right, the smart futurists will say, well, these are some scenarios, these are some options. This could happen, but I'm not saying it will. Yeah. So we have gotten smarter as futurists. The other thing is, of course, most futurists are very occupied with the very short-term future, right? If you're going to have a life as a futurist consultant, you need to speak about consumer issues in the next 3 to 5 years, which I guess in my book isn't really futurism. So it's a little bit of an uncomfortable label for someone with an academic background also to call yourself a futurist, but I have chosen to stick with it for a bunch of different reasons. One is, I think the future is too important to just joke around and say, well, I don't know anything about the future. The future, actually, the long-term future, and by that I right now mean the next 25 to 50 years, around that, and perhaps towards the end of this century, so around 2100, is really, really consequential for humanity. So you can't sit around and say, well, I'm a futurist, but I don't know anything about it. So I have chosen to dedicate a bunch of my time over the next years to researching the fairly distant future. So I'm engaged with that. And what do I know about it right now? I can tell you there are certain things that we know unless there are disruptive events, right? So I'm studying risk, and there are a lot of risks on the table right now. Many of them are cascading risks. So I can also tell you that I have a hypothesis, which is many of the things that people are both the most excited about right now when it comes to emerging technology like AI, synthetic biology, nanotech, quantum, these kinds of things, we're probably scared of the wrong things within those technologies. And also the kinds of sort of societal disasters that we might be scared about today. For example, NASA, is scared about asteroids and diverted an asteroid last week. We are scared of, climate change and climate is changing. And right now, the specter of nuclear war, all of those things are, of course, enormously scary. But my current hypothesis, and that's a research hypothesis, it's a research project, is that there probably are a bunch of other opportunities and risks that we are not seeing. And also, if the world's going to end, or if the world's going to be upended by an enormous innovation, that will probably not be squarely within the categories that we have today. I mean, that's just not how history has tended to work. So then how do you uncover that kind of change? And that's the process I'm involved in. So it has to do with looking at the second order, maybe the lower priority risks, the lower priority technologies, and then fishing in that ocean to try to see how these things will combine. And that's why I use the word cascading risks and cascading opportunities, or perhaps knock-on effects between different things. I think there's much more fertile ground there for speculating about the future than thinking about these very, very obvious things like, will AI get this and that done? That's so obviously not going to happen the way we think of it today.
Tell me, Trond, I mean, you have such a wide range of interests. Seems like a very knowledgeable guy. How do you prioritize what to focus your time on? I mean, it just seems like there's a lot you could study. You could read more. You could, there's probably a lot of things you could do. How do you prioritize your subjects and focus?
In one of my latest books, Future Tech, I spend about 3 chapters on that because I have thought long and hard about this. I even tried to start a company. It's still around. It just, is no Silicon Valley sort of rocket ship yet. But, building your own personal insight ecosystem, as I would call it, or kind of your epistemic sort of playground where you know exactly what sources you're going to, where you should spend your time and where you should spend less time in order to kind of stay up to date on the kinds of things you have decided to do. First off, you have to decide what are you truly interested in, because I don't believe that it's possible. So you may characterize me as someone who does a lot of different things. In my head, I don't. I have a very, very prioritized set of things that I look at. I look at, a small number of emerging technologies. I always look at the overarching societal context to those technologies. And then I look at long historical, sort of global historical trends. And I look at nothing else. So for me, that is very focused. Now, the second question is, where would you find the sources for that? And I am enormously selective, Richard. That's how I think you can be sane with that kind of interest. So the kinds of sources that I look in, I have been honing over a long period of time, and I have been trying to build a system to share that with others, because I'm interested not just in sharing my system, but I want to know what other people's systems are. And I think we need to build these systems in order to understand our world as it evolves. So I try to write about it in this book, Future Tech. And I think the most important thing is that if you're going to really call yourself an expert on anything in this emerging world, you cannot choose one area. You have to choose multiple, but not too many. So that sounds pretty obvious, but for the longest time here, there was this notion of a T-shaped expert, right? The challenge with that notion, which essentially says, be an expert in one domain and be a good communicator. You can paraphrase it that way. No. I'm sure the defender of that phrase will say, well, T-shaped means more than that. But I would say that's just the wrong approach. You're not going to get anywhere with that. If you don't know more than one thing in depth, you have actually nothing to talk to other people about. Plus, you don't know your own blind spots. So what I'm trying to do is an insurance policy against blind spots. That doesn't mean that I'm all over the place, but it means that I'm probably in 5 places instead of 1. But I'm not in 10. That is impossible. No. I guess I'm in about 5 places. That's sort of how I see it. And then you dig deep, very, very deep in those. And, maybe I have spent more time digging in 5 different places than others typically do. So that's becomes, people call it jack of all trades, right? But I happen to believe that that is a very, very comfortable place to be right now. Because if you choose something else, you actually lose the connection between the areas.
Well, I know you just finished writing that book, and congratulations. Are you working on another book already, or you're taking some time off before starting the next book?
No, I'm working on a book on ecological technologies that my deadline is the end of the year. So that should be
wow.
coming out in 2023.
Oh.
And then I'm working on this book on 50 years into the future, scenarios for 2075, which will be more about the intersection of risk and opportunity from technologies. So that's what I currently have. And then my children's book has to wait a little bit longer, but should be there hopefully in the next year.
Well, Trond, this has been a really interesting conversation. I really appreciate your taking the time. I know you've covered so many different topics. When you finish that future book or your children's book, please come back and tell me about it.
I would love to. Thank you so much for having me.
This is Richard Chu and Trond Undheim. Thank you.